Portraits are one of my favourite subjects to paint, and for a while now I've really wanted to be able to create illustrative paintings of people that tell stories, that capture colours and lighting and evoke emotion. What I came to discover was that there was a bit of a gap between my artistic vision and my skill set. So at the beginning of this year, I set out to practice portraits and learn the skills that I need in order to fulfill this artistic vision. What I found out early on was that sticking to a monochromatic palette actually helped me learn more and faster. I was able to get through more faces because the method is quicker than doing full colour portraits, and more volume helps with a quicker learning curve. And it also simplified the process for me because it had me focusing on a few factors, mainly the accuracy of the face and the tonal range, without having to add in the whole layer of colour mixing and thinking about the colour palette, which are definitely things that I will have to learn about eventually, but for now I am on this step. Today I wanted to invite you to follow my process in painting a sketchbook spread of faces and hopefully inspire you to do some monochromatic portrait painting yourself. I always start by planning the spread, and this helps me waste less time when I actually start painting, as I have all the faces picked out and positioned where I want to put them in the sketchbook. So once I've laid out my faces on Illustrator, I begin sketching. And I learned early on that for me the sketch isn't super important with this style of painting, as I actually end up covering the initial sketch quite quickly and having to essentially paint without the guide of the sketch below. So I don't really spend a lot of time on the sketch. Today I'm using Holbein gouache and I'm using primary white and indigo, but essentially any darker toned colour will work, as you want to be able to achieve a really wide tonal range from dark to very light when mixed with white. So I always start by picking out the lightest part of the face that isn't a bright highlight and laying down a wash of this colour all over the face. So I want to cover the whole portrait to start with, so I can start building my layers from there. And I do the same with the hair. I just lay down one flat colour for the hair and I'll build on that later. I then start looking for the different shapes that the shadows of the face makes. I try to approach these portraits as a culmination of different shapes that the shadows and the bone structure is making, versus seeing it as a face or as a whole. I think it breaks it down and makes it a bit easier. And to change the tone of this blue, I'm adding more of the indigo to make it darker. So I'm only having to think of these two paints and making the colour either darker or lighter, which is so much easier than thinking of a whole range of colours. The layers of paint that I'm putting down are one flat colour. I'm not doing much blending at all. I'm just thinking about the shapes that the shadows are creating and putting down progressively either darker or lighter layers of paint, depending on the area of the face, which then makes it look more three-dimensional. I then laid down the features of the face with a darker tone of blue, and initially it does look a bit cartoony because it's kind of like the outlines, but as I start adding more highlights and lowlights, it begins to look less flat. I put down this piece of tracing paper because toned paper really picks up on any oil you may have on your hand, and I think I had just moisturized my hands and then I started creating all these smudges on the page, which was really annoying, but yeah, a piece of tracing paper will help with that. Then mixing a lighter tone of blue, I begin to add the highlights. I try not to make the highlights pure white because you want to leave the really bright highlights for the tiny areas like the eyes or the tip of the nose. And I think that really adds to that realistic factor of the portrait instead of kind of making it too cartoony if you're using bright white for some of the bigger highlights. The highlights really start to give it dimension and it's no longer looking as flat, which is the satisfying part of when the portrait starts to really come together. As the darker tones of gouache dry, they actually go lighter, so I'm able to see when it starts drying that I need to go back in and make some of those shadows even darker. For me, the final step in the process is to go in and add all those tiny details that make the face so interesting to look at. And this is how she turned out. The first face is always the one that takes the longest because you're kind of warming up. But as I went along the spread, I definitely got progressively quicker and looser, and I think that you can see even just within these 2 pages how there's a little bit of a learning curve, which I think really goes back to the point of the more you do, the more confidence you get and the more you're learning. So it's actually within your interest to do as many as possible, even if they're not perfect, which is why I love this method so much. I'm going to speed up the next clips of the portraits that I did on this page. I'll put some timestamps below so you can skip to whichever one you want to see. Then I'll catch up with you on one of the last portraits that I did and explain my process on that one. So on this face, I couldn't get her left eye quite right and I ended up repainting it a couple of times. But the great thing about gouache is that because it reactivates with water, you can essentially erase certain parts of the painting by going over it with water on your brush and then waiting for it to dry and then repainting. You do need good paper for this as you're loading up the page with a lot of water and paint and you don't want it to buckle or start breaking. But I do find Strathmore's mixed media paper takes several layers of paint and water really well, so I really recommend it. So I mentioned how the sketch is not a huge part of my process. I don't spend loads of time doing details, but I do love to get the sketch as anatomically accurate as possible. The best method I found for me for drawing portraits is the Loomis method. I'll link below some videos I've used to help me learn the method, but essentially I do a very basic and stripped back version. You can definitely get more detailed with it, but I like to use it for the basic placement of the features, as well as ensuring that if the head is tilted or turned a slight way, I am able to accurately place how the features look from different angles. I really loved painting this portrait and how it turned out, and a big reason for this was the reference photo I used. I would really highly recommend picking photos that have very good lighting, and by good lighting I mean high contrast between where the light is hitting certain areas of the face and then creating deeper shadows in other areas. This creates a really striking effect, and it's also easier, more interesting to paint and look at, rather than a portrait where there's more soft lighting and there's not really those tonal changes. I really hope you enjoyed watching my process on these, and please do tag me if you end up doing some monochromatic portrait studies yourself. You definitely don't need to just stick to gouache to do these. I think you can use any medium that you are most comfortable with. I think the point is just to stick to this monochromatic palette so that you can really focus on building certain skills first and then moving on to colour. I'm excited to see what you create, and I'll see you in my next video.